we've got another speaker right here. He's all queued up, and I think you already know who he is. Ashok Misra is the chair of the CNP Payment Forum, and he owns Alina Consultants. He's an expert on purchase paths and e-commerce, and he actually moderated the investment panel yesterday, so you've already met him. And he asks a lot of questions, too, right? Every time we go to the audience, he's got a question. So, all right, Ashok, I think there's a clicker up there also, so you're in good shape.
Few satoshis, it'll be hard, but just on a personal note, my decks used to be kind of very bland, so I decided for this event it needs some oomph, and I found a guy on Fiverr who was willing to do it in BTC. He's in Karachi, shipped it off to him, and he turned it around overnight, so this really works. But of course, I should have proofed the first page. So the purpose really of my talk is to tell you how traditional e-commerce works on the internet, and what, you know, the system that we're replacing, like Bitcoin, you know, how superior it is. Basically, the pain points for e-commerce payments, they're just numerous. And then, you know, hopefully before lunch, you should know exactly what the friction points are and why Bitcoin is a dramatically better system. The kind of interesting thing is that in Satoshi's first paper, he talks about a peer-to-peer system for transferring value on the internet, right? So I kind of like to think that the first use case he had in mind was really e-commerce and peer-to-peer payment on the internet. But obviously, you can't divorce that from sovereign currencies. But he never really mentioned sovereign currencies in his paper. So, you know, I think from my perspective, he was first trying to tackle the problem of peer-to-peer payment on the internet using internet transport. So a little bit about me is that I've spent about 20 years developing financial apps, wire transfers, e-commerce purchase paths. I was the first engineer in payments in Amazon.com to work on the application that connects to their payment gateway. And it was a development of about 5 years to connect with 7 or 8 major payment providers in the US and Germany and the UK. Now I believe they have 50 or 60 processors, or maybe 100, running on the same backbone that we used in the early startup days. So that was where I got most of my experience in online shopping applications. And then I moved over around doing the same stuff until about 2 years ago. I just decided to do something for myself and had an interest in Bitcoin. So that's kind of my interest and career transition. So coming back to e-commerce payment systems, I think there are just some very unique characteristics required for shopping carts. And they're not really addressed with credit card payments because, firstly, credit cards are not really designed for internet use. They're designed on the POS. We've just kind of adapted it to work on the internet. Like we ask for dumb authentication, like expiry date. And then when banks figure that it does not work, they use CVV2, 3D secure, but they're just very primitive. And the system really hasn't changed at a fundamental level for 20 or 30 years. There are kind of patches around security, pins, and EMV as an example of that. But it really hasn't changed at a fundamental level. So, well, I guess everybody here knows the Bitcoin purchase path from a consumer. I think, oh, there's another bug here. So basically, you just look at a merchant's receipt, which has a Bitcoin destination, and you can send a payment right away. And this is essentially what it looks like for the consumer and the merchant. That's a simplified version of an e-commerce purchase path over credit cards, and it's very simplified. It has only the main moving parts. But just to walk you through it, firstly, I don't have a pointer, but if you look down at step 1, the consumer kind of populates the shopping cart and then is ready to check out, and the web server is ready to accept payment. The card number goes over SSL to the payment processor, and in the hope of getting it authorized with the amount on the shopping cart. The processor then sends it to the Visa and MasterCard or Discover network. Visa and MasterCard are open loop, or Amex or Discover, which are closed loop payment systems. That finally goes all the way to the consumer's issuing bank. And the consumer issuing bank then finds out if the customer has enough float for them to authorize a transaction. And if the customer has the float and the transaction looks good and the merchant is not looking suspicious, they authorize a transaction. And so the same message comes back, well, a similar message comes back to the POS or to the web server, which says, okay, the payment is good and you can ship goods to the customer. And that's when that's when the transaction kind of comes to a logical end from the consumer's point of view, and they know they're going to get shipped. But that's not the end of the story. The merchant has to, once again, send a transaction to kind of consummate that payment. The merchant has to pass a settlement message. And the settlement message mentions a final amount and the clearing and stuff like that. And this message goes, again, all the way back to the issuer through the acquiring bank. And then the consumer sees that amount on the statement at the end of the month. Now, you'll notice that there are two unique entities here in terms of banks and financial institutions. One is the consumer's bank, and that's the bank which gives you your plastic in the mail and who gives you the float or your credit or your debit. And then there's the merchant's bank, and that's not very well known to the consumer, or common knowledge for people who are not in payment processing, is that the merchant actually has to get underwritten by a bank, and that's called the acquiring bank. So the acquiring bank basically protects the merchant and releases funds to the merchant, or comes in the case of disputes. So basically, if you're a business and you want to start taking credit cards on the web, there's no way out. You have to have a bank that will acquire you. And for that, they need to see your credentials and you need to see your creditworthiness. Because from their perspective, if you go belly up, there's got to be somebody who protects consumers. And that's kind of the basis of this, is that it's a kind of insurance for the card network that merchants are underwritten, and there's somebody to protect consumers in case merchants default on their obligations. So we come into the pain, really, the pain points for a merchant, and the first is underwriting. So obviously, the bank would not be willing to underwrite anybody, right? They want to see that you're in good standing and you're not going to default. So in order to do that, they obviously need your credentials, they need your bank statements, they need a lot of details on your board of directors, and it's a pretty complex process, almost like buying a home. But obviously, if you're a shop in the garage, selling a small amount of things, you don't really have to go through this elaborate process. But for a decent-sized business, it's a process that can take several weeks. And it would go through a number of steps and interviews, and finally you would get a merchant account, and that's kind of the end point, that you have a merchant account, and you can start accepting credit cards only after you have the merchant account. The other pain of onboarding is really to decide what your MCC is. It's a term that defines your kind of business. And if you're if you are a business selling, let's say, religious books on the internet, you're viewed differently, kind of low risk. But if you're selling adult stuff or gambling, you're viewed as very high risk. And the interchange category kind of enables the banks to know what the destination of that transaction is. And so they can apply their own fraud rules or pricing rules. So the price for a merchant selling religious books is probably different from a gambling merchant. The gambling merchant would attract much higher fees. Then you need bank accounts, obviously, but very often in payment processing, you have to give your payment processor kind of power of attorney on your bank account. They should be able to dip into it because on a particular day, if you have more refunds or more chargebacks than settlements that are coming in, they want to protect themselves by having a power of attorney and the ability to ding your bank account. The other pain of onboarding really is determining your SKU currency. This gets very complicated for online merchants, and it's got a number of moving parts. The most simplest use case is if you're, let's say, a US merchant, and your SKUs are priced in US dollars. You come in from a European point of view, you obviously see the SKU price in US dollars, right? And you shop, you complete the transaction, check out, and then you have no clue as to how much you're paying in euros. It's going to be a surprise for you until the bank stamps the transaction, what rate they took, and if they took any fees from you. So just in order to safeguard this and make it less painful for consumers, banks have devised products called multi-currency. So you can price your SKU in euros as a US merchant, and then consumers from Europe could see that if you geolocate their IP or apply some other rules. But in terms of settlement, it gets very complicated. Are you going to price your SKU in a fixed euro amount? Are you going to dynamically price it? And you have to take these kind of business decisions, which are not easy. Do you want to then have your processor remit to you in US dollars, or do you want them to remit to you in euros? That's an important decision, too. You might have no payroll and no reason to hold euros. But if your settlement is coming in euros and you transfer it right away, you're obviously protecting yourself from the currency fluctuation risk. But you might just decide that in the long run, it's better for you to hold euros. And these things get complicated very quickly. And that's just for cross-border transaction. Now, banks may want to hold a reserve on you because they want to protect themselves, once again, if you go belly up. And they might request that you hold a kind of bank note with them for 300 grand. And it's kind of arbitrary, but what they'll do is kind of evaluate your risk and accordingly decide what your reserve requirement will be. So we have a short time before lunch. If you feel that you have a burning issue, feel free to raise your hand and I can answer it. Does everyone here know about PCI? I guess not. It's very few. So PCI is a regulation which is imposed by the brands, that's Visa and MasterCard. And every merchant who accepts credit cards in any form on the web or even in retail POS is obliged to abide by PCI. PCI is kind of a security compliance directive. It's not federal regulation. It's just a compliance rule set that the banks have decided, and they enforce it through a very complex means of auditing and compliance, kind of write-off by auditors, depending on the size of merchant. But it's really a huge deal. And it just seems to be getting worse every year in the sense that now we have the 3.0 version of the data security standard. It's kind of evolved to this stage. It used to be just a guideline before. But what you need to do is, if you accept more than 6 million Visa transactions as a merchant, you're classified as a tier 1 merchant. You need to get an external auditor who is qualified by the PCI Security Council to come to your premises and sign off on your security. The security compliance is a 12-point program. It's about 100 pages. Covers a vast bunch of control objectives like security, encryption, how you store your keys, and these things have to be ticked off and checked systematically by auditor. So the other is it also prohibits you from storing authentication information. So authentication data is your expiry date of the card, CVV, which is pretty backward. And that gives you a sense on how credit card security is implemented, is that there's some very protected information about you, but you actually hand it over to merchants. And then you tell the merchants, you guys got to be caged. You can't store this. It has to be transient. This operating system is not OK. This one's OK. So it gets complicated very soon and very hard to kind of administer for them. But this is kind of the central point, I think, about security, is that with credit card security, you have to hand all your credentials to the merchant. And Bitcoin security, you can go over HTTP connection. It just doesn't matter. Security, in that sense, is a complete non-issue. And that's what's dramatically different about Bitcoin. So coming to interchange pain, we've got some sense of it in the micropayments talk, but I'll just give you some more details about it. So interchange is the fees that are decided by the bank for processing credit cards. They're transparent in the sense there's a manual that's updated every 3 months that gives you interchange categories and what interchange a particular transaction will attract for a certain MCC. For retail on the web, it's typically about 1.5 plus 15 cents. And for the retail, for the web shopping, it's considered a card not present transaction where the customer is not present, so it attracts about maybe 80 or 90 basis points interchange higher than the retail experience. Now, you just cannot negotiate interchange fee at all. It's a non-starter for discussion. And you would think that with payment processing, the free market rules would apply, and as you do more volume, the cost would go down. But no, if you're selling one SKU in your garage, or if you're a Walmart, you pay exactly the same interchange fee. And this creates trouble, really, for micropayments. Because of the fixed fee of 15 cents, it's just not profitable to sell a SKU for $1. There's a sweet spot, I think about $8 or $9, where it makes sense to sell a SKU. I got some of the Berlin air giving me a bug. The other is around loyalty cards and airline rewards and cards attached to hotels, which are treated as premium cards, which you have to shell out as a merchant. It's kind of a common question. Who's really paying for frequent flyer miles and credit card points? It's actually merchants are paying for them in the form of interchange. It's very hidden, but a card which is a premium card, like a platinum, with attached to some airline reward program, might attract about 40 to 50 basis points higher than a vanilla card. And you as a merchant are obliged to take that card. You can't see it at checkout and say, OK, I don't want to take this card. It's too expensive. There's a kind of universal law of credit card acceptance that says you have to accept all cards. If you're a storefront and you have that decal of the brands, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, you're obliged to accept every card that has the decal. And for a long time in the US, you could not really give a discount for cash, but the rules changed slightly right now, and you can technically charge a lower fee for people who pay in cash, but it's very, very hard to do, really. Now, the fee is really set by the duopoly, that's Visa and MasterCard, and they kind of update their fee structure every 3 months. They release a bulletin, which is effective immediately. We've seen it typically climb up slowly. There's been some regulation around debit cards where the fee is about 30 or 40 basis points lower, but it's kind of creeps up slowly to around, for merchants, to about 3.5%. So then there's pain of refunds and chargebacks. So we didn't discuss really how refunds work, but there's a lot of moving parts there. It's not like just voiding the original transaction, reversing it, and kind of collecting the balance and giving it back to the consumer. You really have to create a refund batch transaction for all your refunds for the day and send that sometimes over FTP to the bank, and then they send you a response file after 2 or 3 days, and then they send the funds back to the consumer, but just a lot of moving parts, and it doesn't go seamlessly in the back end at all. So the fraud for transactions on the web, the fraud rate is about 4 basis points in the US. In some verticals and some industry sectors, it's pretty alarming. They haven't really found a way to curb this just because of the easy manner in which you can sniff the information, from web servers. And it's just kind of an impossible problem to tackle, really, to reduce it below this 3 or 4 basis points. So you also have merchants who can take orders over the phone, right? So you read out your card to them. And PCI mandates that the recording equipment for customer service is protected and there's encryption, or for customer service calls, you have to stop recording when the customer reads out the number. But just in spite of all that, there is fraud that trickles in. Because basically, all you need to do is hear the conversation, either build plastic with that and create a mag stripe on it with that number, or just use it on the web. Because you got the expiry date, you got the card number, and you got the CVV on that phone call. There's a new technique that banks are doing, or merchants rather, which is getting a lot of publicity, and that's around tokenization. So the first time you come to the web experience, you enter your card number there, a message goes to the bank and back, and they tokenize it and send you back a token. And thereafter, for every subsequent charge, you don't need the raw number anymore. You can send the token. It's good. It works. But still, there's a first attempt at getting the token, which is insecure, and fraud could happen there. So we saw on the first page that you don't get your money as a merchant immediately, right? Once you sell a SKU. There's a batch process by which you stamp your transactions for the day, and then your money gets released. Typically, it gets released after 2 to 3 days for a decent-sized merchant. But this creates a problem because your suppliers are not going to extend the same credit to you. So obviously, there's a float problem if you're running lean. And this problem is not there in Bitcoin, right? You get your cash immediately, but if you're a merchant accepting credit cards, you just have to factor in that you're not going to get your funds immediately. There's some processors who would hold your settlements deliberately for maybe a few weeks. For example, PayPal could do that if you're selling something they consider suspicious, like VPN boxes and stuff. And they've got complete control over that, and they can do that by law, So it's just not very good from a merchant point of view. And then if you send your last settlement batch for the week on Friday at 8 p.m., you might just miss the cutoff for the week, and then you kind of delayed till the next week. It's a batch system that works according to banking rules. The other technical pain really is around architecture. We discussed tokenization, but banks are a single point of failure. They, of course, have redundancy built in, but it's not very infrequent that they go down, their web servers go down. I've seen that most processors with dual sites and load bearing can recover in 5 or 10 minutes after an outage. But sometimes they would not have full functionality after an outage. So it definitely suffers from a single point of failure problem. Yeah, and then EMV and CNP transactions are just introducing a lot of pain points right now in the US, because the US is the last country in the industrialized world to still have magstripe technology. There's a roadmap to go to EMV, but there are no real mandates there. What they've done in the US is that we're going to follow a standard of signature and card and EMV rather than PIN and EMV. And the mandate in the US right now is that whoever prevents the EMV transaction from occurring is going to be liable for fraud. So if you have a EMV card, you go to a merchant, and they cannot accept EMV because they don't have the reader, then the merchant's acquiring bank is responsible for that fraud and that transaction. On the other hand, if you reverse that and your issuer has just given you a card without EMV, you go to a merchant and they have to swipe that transaction, then your issuer is responsible because they didn't give you an EMV card. So that's how the mandate is going to play out in the US. So I don't hear the clanging of plates, but it's going to be hard to continue after that. Why don't we open up for questions?
Yep, we got time for 1 or 2 questions. Anybody have a question they want to ask Ashok? Doesn't look like it.
Well, I guess it's all question. Easily understood.
All right, here we go. We do have one.
So I have one remark and one question. So first, the remark regarding the interchange fees. So for example, in Europe, they will be regulated soon. So there will be a cap for debit card payments of 0.3 and for debit card payments of 0.2 by regulation. So, and the question is from the user side. So in e-commerce, sometimes I also would like to revoke a payment. And so, well, you focus on the merchant side, so what would be a solution for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Now, about the caps on interchange, it's good. I think there's kind of an awareness that these charges are arbitrary. We don't have control over them. They're kind of anti-free market. There's an awareness of that. But I think a cap is good in that direction. But I think it's still kind of monopolistic kind of deal out here, because as a consumer, as a merchant, you can go to another processor who offers lower rates, right? And your second question is around, from the consumer's point of view. I think that's kind of a more complex question. But what we have in the credit card world is that we have arbitration by the banks who process the transaction, right? In Bitcoin, you can think of kind of an eBay mechanism that you don't want the party who's operating the financial network to arbitrate. And with scripting, it's possible to create a kind of escrow service, right? Which would be much more powerful, perhaps, than what we have right now for both parties. Like, for example, through scripting, you could mandate that I'm delivering something, right, to you. You paid for me in BTC, but through scripting, you could have the delivery operator release that payment. Or if it's a very valuable good, you could have somebody offer an escrow for that. So I think it's much more powerful for chargebacks and refunds. But in the system we have right now, the benefit is entirely to the consumers. As a consumer, you can call the bank and say, hey, I didn't do it, or out of the TV, what I got, one channel doesn't work, I'm charging it back. And that becomes more difficult with Bitcoin. Hope that answers the question.
Nicholas Zumino from Paris. I think it's pretty clear that the Bitcoin payment solution is technically much easier and much more affordable payment solution. So my question is, how is merchant acceptance of Bitcoin is going? What's the rate, or what's the level, or is it growing, or how? And second question is, what's driving merchant acceptance of Bitcoin? I've got a feeling it's probably following the rate of Bitcoin owners or people willing to pay with Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think personally, I see a lot of uptake in it, like Expedia, Overstock, Wikimedia is taking donations in Bitcoin, and then Automatic Ink, who does WordPress, staking Bitcoin. I think many of them are taking it for idealistic reasons, and there's not really a very big merchant out there who's taking Bitcoin and holding Bitcoin. So I just hear a lot of critics saying that, Expedia and Overstock, they're not good examples because they're using a processor in between. But I don't think I have the same view. It doesn't really matter to me. If there's a BitPay in between, it does mean that somebody wants to extract Bitcoins out of the system. It just so happens that the merchant doesn't have the stomach for it and wants to receive USD. Because the merchant has a problem, they have to pay the suppliers and they have to pay wages in regular currency, so they can't really accept Bitcoin, and that's understandable. But since it's such a beta movement, I think soon we'll see merchants who want to hold on to BTC. But to answer your question, there is an uptake, but mostly in merchants who are using like BitPay type processors, and they want to show a skew in BTC, but have no intention of holding BTC.
All right. Well, that's great. I'm afraid we'll have to end it here.
Thank you.
But you'll be around for the rest of the day. So that's
Yes.
great. Thanks for
Thank you.
doing a great job. We appreciate it. Let's give him
Thank
a big
you.
round of applause.